Gresham College presents Christian Faith and Modern Art, Searching for New Ways, by the Right Reverend Lord Harries of Pentragarth.
Now, as we know, art has always been subject to fashion, and during the 20th century, as a result of the influence of the media, those changes in fashion have been trumpeted as never before. Moreover, those changes have had an international dimension. And so it is that since World War II, of the most talked about styles, abstract expressionism and pop art, both originated in the United States. It's vitally important, I think, to remember that what is of immediate interest and fashion may not be of long-term significance. And more particularly, British art in this period has been distinguished by a range of individual styles, as the distinguished art historian Francis Spalding has put it, rejecting a view of history that sees it in terms of a linear progression with one radical new style following another. She's written, innovation has instead been made through a return to personal convictions or native traditions, to a revival of narrative, for example, or a realist approach. The individualism inherent in British art has liberated artists from an unthinking adoption of fashionable styles. So with that point in mind, particularly Spalding stressed on the individualism inherent in British art, which has liberated it from a slavish following of fashion. I'm going now to consider a number of artists, most of them born sort of in the middle to late 20s, who made their reputation after World War II, say in the 1960s, 70s, but who are no longer living. But first, a very, very brief look at an American artist who is regarded as one of the great figures of abstract expressionism, but who could perhaps better be termed a minimalist, Barnett Newman, who lived from 1905 to 1970. This was called one-ment, which immediately for Christians brings to mind the phrase at-one-ment. And many of his paintings, although they were severely abstract in style, did have a religious title. Between 1958 and 1966, he painted a series of Stations of the Cross, calling them Labus Lama Sabachthani, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?, which he saw as a memorial to the Holocaust. There are those Stations of the Cross. And there are three of them. Now, there's no similar attempt in Britain that I'm aware of. If you're aware of, perhaps you can let me know afterwards, to deploy abstract expressionism or minimalism so directly for religious purposes. Instead, we look to the particular unique style of each artist, though all were, of course, shaped by the modern movement as a whole. Craigie Aitchison lived from 1926 to 2009. His father, also Craigie, Sir Craigie Aitchison, was a brilliant QC who became a judge and then the first socialist advocate in Scotland. Both his parents had some interest in painting, and although Craigie did 4 years' study at the bar, he had no heart for it, spending time going to the Tate and learning to copy pictures. So he went instead to study at the Slade, whose emphasis at the time was on meticulous drawing. This was neither Craigie's interest nor talent, and he stood out from the first by producing very different kinds of painting. In the 1950s, he belonged to the Young Bohemian artistic set in London, going from one temporary lodging to another. However, he did have some success with his painting and was early taken up by a gallery. He moved into a house in Kennington, which he decorated in colourful and eccentric ways, where he lived for the rest of his life with his Bedlington dogs, which were central to his life, as you can see from that portrait there. He painted still lifes, which he imbued with a lovely, tranquil mood, and arresting portraits, particularly of a person called Gorgeous George Macaulay, whom he liked to paint with unusual headgear. However, the reason for showing him is because more characteristic of his art than anything else is the series of crucifixions he did all through his life. This is one done in 1995. He painted his first one in 1958 and this continued, as I say, to be the dominant image of his work. They were sometimes criticised by art critics for being repetitive, but in fact there are very many different variations. And he was also criticised from time to time for a naive, childlike style. But in fact, these paintings were meticulously contrived and arrived at. He could spend weeks on a painting, rubbing elements out and changing them before he became even moderately satisfied. And he was primarily concerned with achieving a particular surface effect. Yet although he was primarily concerned with the formal element of a painting, its surface and its colour, the fact that it was the crucifix was dominant in his imaginative thinking. What did it mean to him, we say? What was he trying to say? The short answer is, I'm afraid, we simply don't know. The one major study of Aitchison's subject, Aitchison, has the words, "It has to be said he's unusually reticent on the subject, content to tell the curious how he considers the crucifixion the most horrific story I've ever heard, and little more. They're ganging up against one person. As long as the world exists, one should attempt to record that. It was so unfair." Although he wasn't a regular churchgoer, Christian influence had gone into him deep when he lived in Edinburgh, and he went to many churches during his time there. Now, as we can see from that crucifixion and other ones, there's no emphasis on suffering as such, but there's a sense of spiritual isolation of the lonely individual against the great, sometimes black panorama of nature. Jesus on the cross is often depicted without arms, painted to wood, which seems to suggest human being limited and finite, pinned to the circumstances of his or her life by fate. This sense of spare isolation is very marked in some of his other paintings, for instance, that one of the tree. This is a crucifixion he did in 1984, and you can see that, like others, it has his beloved Bedlington in, and on the crossbar of the cross he has two birds. He kept canaries in his house and had a great feeling, obviously, for the world of animals. Now, these paintings did resonate with the wider public, and at least two cathedrals felt that they were saying something important. Truro Cathedral commissioned a triptych, and Liverpool's Anglican Cathedral a crucifix. The Dean of St. Paul's at that time wanted to buy a crucifixion from Aitchison, but this was vetoed by a member of the chapter. The Dean, however, wrote of the crucifixion, which is now in the Tate Gallery, that particular one, "Here the divine is vulnerable and disturbing, not almighty or ecclesiastical. As in some Eastern religious thinking, the divine, is seen to be at one with nature, the birds and the beasts, suffering with suffering humanity." And a colleague on the chapter at the time noted that Craigie's crucifixions reflect what was stirring in the hidden subconscious of his generation. Now, there are two other kinds of painting which for many people seem to have a religious dimension to them. This is called Goatfell, Isle of Arran, painted in 1993. And this one is called Holy Island, painted in 2001. This was where he spent his childhood holidays with his parents, and where his parents' ashes were buried up there. And Holy Island now has a community of Buddhist monks on it. We now turn to Elizabeth Frink, who lived from 1930 to 1993. Educated at Guildford and Chelsea art schools, she developed a technique following Giacometti of building up figures in plaster, from which she later makes a bronze. She was one of a group of British artists who exhibited at the 1952 Venice Biennale, and whose work was characterized at the time as The Geometry of Fear, a title which reflected both the atmosphere of the Cold War and the growing awareness of the horrors of the Holocaust. Some of her work then and later, when she was very conscious of the oppression in the world, reflects the menacing side of humanity in her male heads, but she witnesses to the victims also with heads of a much gentler aspect. Brought up as a Roman Catholic, she admitted to strong views about Catholicism. She was drawn to Christ, one reason being it enabled her to explore the male body, one of the main themes of her sculpture in various forms. So here we have the head of Christ in 1951, the head of Christ 1983, head of Christ from All Saints Basingstoke in 1986, which perhaps reflects both the strength and the vulnerability she sees in Jesus. She also focused on the Passion story with the Pieta in 1956, which is in the Methodist Art Collection. And she did that crucifix for St. Mary's Lutheran Church in London in 1983. This is a plaster sculpture for the bronze original. And she also did this crucifix in 1966 for the Roman Catholic Metropolitan Cathedral in Liverpool. She received a number of commissions on other themes as well. That's the Eagle Lectern in Coventry Cathedral. This is St. Edmund for St. Edmundsbury and Ipswich Cathedral. And this is perhaps one of her best-known religious sculptures. I'm afraid it's not a very good image. It's the best I could do. It's the Walking Madonna, which you will have seen outside Salisbury Cathedral. And she, when interviewed, she said she deliberately decided not to do a Madonna and Bambino because she wanted to depict the Madonna when her children had grown up and left home. She was commissioned to do a statue of the risen Christ in 1966 for Our Lady of the Wayside, the Roman Catholic Church of Shirley in Solihull. And dominating the church, it depicts the risen Christ showing his 5 wounds to his disciples. And it's said that if you look from the left, you see the beard and Semitic features associated with the Hebrew side, and from the right, the Greek one, so he looks more like Apollo. And that's interesting, of course, because the New Testament tries to combine both a Hebrew and a Greek understanding of religious truth. Her best-known church commission was the risen Christ for Liverpool Cathedral, which she was able to see installed just before her death. She'd suffered a number of bouts of cancer over the years and worked on this in her final illness. Now, we may have doubts about its position high over the west door of the monumental building by Giles Gilbert Scott, but presumably, as she saw it in place, she herself approved of this setting. The foreshortened limbs and the green patina of the bronze against the orange-red sandstone have led to it being described as somewhat alien and lacking a sense of triumph. However, it is also felt that when you actually see the head close up, this does have something of a sense of resurrection about it. And that, of course, is what the statue is meant to be about. Now, Frink is interesting, not least because people tend to think that there wasn't very much religious art going on in the 1950s, 60s and 70s. But you can see from what I've just shown of Elizabeth Frink, I mean, there are half a dozen major pieces commissioned by religious bodies. There's far more about than people are generally aware of. Here's somebody who's not well known, F.N.Souza, Francis Souza, 1924 to 2002, born in Goa. His father died when he was young and he himself caught smallpox. His mother vowed that if he survived, she would dedicate him to the priesthood. He was given the extra name Francis in honour of the patron saint of Goa, and St. Francis Xavier, and was sent to a prestigious Jesuit school of that name. He was expelled from there and later on from his art college. He came to London, where he did achieve quite a significant degree of recognition. And it's interesting, in 2008, one of his paintings sold for the highest ever painting by an Indian on the international market. Brought up as a Roman Catholic, he acknowledged the Roman Catholic Church to be a huge influence on him, especially in his early years. That's a head of Christ from 1948, clearly in a kind of Byzantine iconic style. This is a much harsher painting of the Crucifixion from 1959, where we see his ambivalence to the Catholic Church, where he's reacted against the blonde hair and blue eyes of Western depictions, and there's a great emphasis upon violence and cruelty there. Much serener is his St. Francis of 1961, his two saints in a landscape, rather unusual Paraclete, and perhaps his most successful of his religious paintings, the Crucifixion from 1962, which again I think is in the Methodist collection. A painter who did much more in the way of religious paintings is John Reilly, R-E-I-L-L-Y, lived from 1928 to 2010. This is an early painting of his, Cain and Abel. Trained at Kingston Art College, and having been brought up to love sailing, he initially painted marine subjects. Settled in the Isle of Wight, for 30 years he earned his living as a ceramic artist, but continued to paint as well, his work gradually gaining recognition. Began to paint full-time in 1981. Always interested in biblical painting, 4 of his paintings were purchased by the Methodist Art Collection and in 1964 the BBC made a film about his work. Reilly wasn't interested in painting the actual scene as it might have been in history. Rather, he wanted to paint it in such a way as to bring out its spiritual significance for all people of all time, the eternal, if you like. Nevertheless, he was a serious Christian believer and aware, therefore, of what's been called the scandal of particularity, the Christian belief that the eternal has been specially manifested in one particular person at one particular time. And he developed a particular method for holding these two aspects together, the universal and the particular, the spiritual and the material, the invisible and the visible. He brings out the historical and visible by showing the figures in enclosed, self-contained spaces. And you see this, for example, in the particular and the visible in his painting of Cain and Abel, as one of the pictures in the Methodist collection. You can see that they're in self-enclosed, in enclosed spaces. At the same time, he seeks to indicate the other dimension, the spiritual, through flowing open lines and curves. And we can see this here in the way he's painted the fields and the hills and the sky. And we can see it even more in this raising of Lazarus. Now, what happened over the years is that this flowing, harmonious element in his painting became more prominent, dominating the picture, usually taking the form of part or full circles. And we see this, for example, in his miraculous draught of fishes. All is drawn into the bright circles of eternity. Not surprisingly, the circle has often been used in poetry and elsewhere as an image of eternity, as in Henry Vaughan's famous lines, "I saw eternity the other night, like a great ring of pure and endless light, all calm as it was bright." As Reilly himself wrote, "My paintings are not concerned with the surface appearance of people or things, but try to express something of the fundamental spiritual reality behind this surface appearance. I try to express in visible form the oneness and unity of this invisible power binding all things into one whole." And again he wrote, "I'm trying to paint the glory of God, and through that, the meaning of life." In short, Reilly has an interest in the deeper meaning of every biblical scene. Take, for instance, this Daniel and the lion's den as an example. There's nothing literalistic about it. It's clearly meant to convey the feeling of being under the protection of God, even when faced with the lions of existence. And this is brought out by the text which he uses, not just the story of Daniel itself, but words from Psalm 7. "In thee, O Lord, do I put my trust. Let me never be put to confusion." And another theme which has emerged over the years is relating the human figure to the environment, to indicate the natural and the human worlds in harmony. There you can see the human figure, as it were, under the ground as well as above it. We see this in this picture, great pastures beside still waters. But above all, it is in the harmony of earth and heaven, the eternal and the temporal, that he wishes to convey. And we see this, for example, in this painting of Jacob's ladder, vision of unity. We note the contrast between the rather stiff wooden figure at the bottom and the curved, relaxed one above. The strengths of Reilly's works are clear. They're accessible, they're appealing, and they convey a strong spiritual feeling that is fully integrated with the forms he uses. He's used the developments of 20th century art to bring fresh life to old images and done so in a style which is unmistakably his. Having found his artistic voice, he used it in a consistent and effective way. If we have doubts, it's in the downside of his very strengths. First, a more theological point, his desire to give a universal meaning to the biblical scenes, to see them as a way into a spiritual meaning, which we can experience now, does tend towards a Platonic rather than an incarnational religion. Platonism has, for most of Christian history, been a very good friend and ally of Christianity. But we have to remember that God is not just the eternal now, but has become a particular now from a Christian point of view. Icons of the Orthodox Church try to take us in and through the particular now of the biblical personal scene into that eternal now. But they never lose sight of the fact that we do this in and through the particularity of time and place made manifest in Jesus. Reilly rather depicts the biblical scenes as launching pads out of the particular into the eternal. And the second doubt linked to this is the way all is taken up into harmony and elegance. This is shown artistically in the way some of his paintings seem a bit too geometrically driven. And the theological point behind this criticism is that the suffering of Jesus on the cross is never for him a focus. And this is in contrast with almost every other artist painting Christian themes at the time, for whom it was the suffering of Christ above all that resonated with the terrible suffering of the 20th century. Last year I showed this crucifixion as a rare example of an artist who tried to see the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ as part of one saving event. And this is Reilly's strength. But it is very far, say, from the agony of Christ as depicted by Grunewald on the Eisenheim altar piece. Here is Reilly's resurrection, and the dominant motif in both this and the crucifixion is the circle of light, the circle of eternal life, into which all things are taken up. This is an abiding truth of the Christian faith, but that truth must somehow sit alongside the brutal cruelty of so much human life, which God has taken into himself in the cross of Christ. Enzo Plazzotta lived from 1921 to 1981. This is his crucifixion done in 1974. I saw a little maquette of this about 40 years ago and was very impressed by it. He was born in Venice but spent most of his working life in London. He made his living mainly by making bronzes of horses, but you will see many of his sculptures around on the streets of London because he was often commissioned to do really rather attractive, moving human figures. But he did also work occasionally on Christian themes, and this is one of them. What I like about this is the way that the two thieves beside Christ here are, as it were, lifted up on Christ's own crossbar. Dealt with him very quickly, as also I'm dealing with another artist, John Hayward, very quickly, 1929 to 2000. This is the baptism of Christ. John Hayward has more than 230 windows or church interiors to his credit, which is an amazing number. And this is his Jacob's ladder. And another artist whom I'm going to consider very quickly, Hans Feibusch, 1921 to 1981. This is the baptism of Christ at Chichester Cathedral. Hans Feibusch made his name as an artist in Germany and was exhibited in the 1937 degenerative art exhibition put on by the Nazis. He fled to England, converted to Christianity, and was much befriended by Bishop Bell of Chichester, who commissioned him to do this mural in Chichester Cathedral. He received many commissions in his life, both for civic and church work. He reconverted to Judaism before his death, which was just short of his 100th birthday. His style is more representational than most of the artists we have been or will be considering. This, for instance, is his Christ nailed to the cross, a chalk drawing, very well done chalk drawing. Another person I'm dealing with very quickly, Kyffin Williams, 1918 to 2000, regarded as the foremost painter of Wales of the 20th century, studied at the Slade and then taught at Highgate School for many years, came from and lived in Anglesey and was predominantly a painter of the Welsh landscape. Here's the Anglesey coastal scene, and here's the Welsh mountains. However, he did paint a few Christian scenes which very much rely on Renaissance prototypes. So here is Christ on the cross. Here is Christ being taken down from the cross. And here is Christ being lowered into the grave, which is clearly after one of the great Renaissance paintings. Somebody else whom I'm going to consider briefly, whom you won't have heard of, Hildegard Nicholas, lived from 1913 to 1995. She was Swedish by birth and trained as a designer. She lived in Oxford and was married to the principal of Brasenose College. A visit to Ravenna inspired her to take up mosaics, and she produced a number of miniature mosaics, each hardly more than 2 feet long and a feet high, literally made up of thousands and thousands of tiny pieces of splintered glass. She received 2 commissions for larger works. This is the cross in the chapel of the John Radcliffe Hospital, Oxford, which, although simple, I've always found an extraordinarily effective and powerful. And the other work she was commissioned for was also in a hospital chapel of Bournemouth General Hospital, and this is obviously the prodigal. I very much like both her mosaics. I wish we had more of her work available. Going now to spend rather more time on a couple of artists. Albert Herbert lived from 1925 to 2008. This is a self-portrait. And this is Elijah fed by a raven. When he was a principal lecturer at St. Martin's School of Art in the 1960s and 70s, Herbert for a time gave up painting in a representational way, repressing his drive to make images that tell stories. However, finding abstraction too restricted, he eventually found a way back to figurative painting through looking at children's art and making primitive, illustrative, figurative etchings. Initially, he had no religious education or interest in religion, but he was received into the Roman Catholic Church in 1958. And over his last 5 decades, Herbert consistently painted surprising and dreamlike images that are the product of an unusual and highly individual imagination. His seemingly naive yet sophisticated paintings were the result of his lifelong journey exploring, quotes, what lies beneath the surface of the mind. He was on a lifelong search for the marvellous, which began with a youthful encounter with surrealism. Recognized as an artist with a powerful and original poetic vision, Herbert is of particular interest in relation to the theme of this series of lectures. First of all, set amongst and influenced by changing modern artistic fashions, he found himself out of sympathy with the prevailing styles and struggled for a very long time to find his own visual voice. Secondly, discovering that he was by nature religious, a fact he couldn't do anything about, he also struggled hard as to how to express his religious vision, and these 2 struggles fused into one. Although friends with the fashionable avant-garde of the time, he knew himself to be an outsider, but one who was early championed by Sister Wendy Beckett, who regarded him as the most significant contemporary religious artist of the time. Born in Bow and brought up in Forest Gate, he came from a very modest home with no cultural hinterland. When he left school, he worked for a picture library and read a magazine on surrealist art, which affected him deeply. This is Nativity with a Burning Bush, 1991. And it came as a revelation to him that art was about revealing the marvellous. And always a compulsive drawer, he attended evening classes at St. Martin's and, as he said, totally fell in love with art and wanted to study full-time, which then seemed quite impossible. In 1943, at the age of 18, he was called up and he took part in the second wave of the Normandy landings and the advance afterwards, during which 3/4 of his regiment were killed or wounded. And this picture is entitled, He Remembers Himself as a Soldier, age 18, but painted much later in 2003. After the war, a series of scholarships enabled him to study art, eventually taking him to the Royal College of Art, where his contemporaries like John Brackby were realists of the kitchen sink school of art. Herbert found he was looking for something more subjective, art with more emotional significance, and he saw something of what he was looking for in the work of Francis Bacon. When he exhibited with the realists, a critic said of his work that he was, quotes, like John the Baptist crying in the wilderness. Herbert held teaching jobs at Leicester and Birmingham Art Colleges, then at St. Martin's, where for a number of years he was senior lecturer. During this time, American abstract art became all the rage for his students. Feeling himself old-fashioned and outdated, it was a difficult time for him. I think this is reflected in his 1960 painting, Wasteland. And so for a time, he threw himself into modernism. This is Thames 4, 1963. However, although his modernistic paintings actually are quite accessible and attractive, he found it simply was not for him. He decided to try to find his way back into figurative painting through etching. And he said, I used to creep down to the etching room in the basement of St. Martin's and work at these little prints, literary, illustrative, with bits of theology hiding behind childish jokes. All the opposite of what my modernist colleagues were teaching on the top floor. Eventually, he learned to draw again, as I said, by looking at children's drawings. And this led him, quotes, to drawing what I felt and knew rather than what it looked like. And this, for instance, is reflected in his Jonah series, which is one of the persistent themes of his paintings. Jonah and the Whale from 1985, Jonah and the Whale for 2005, Jonah and the Whale from 1987, Jonah Arrives in Nineveh, 2004. And this persistent theme in his painting had a very personal meaning for him, because he felt he'd run away from his true calling and been swallowed up by the whale of modernism. However, that whale had spewed him up on the shore of figurative painting, his true calling. This is Ladder from 2004. And this is Moses on the Mountain of God. Studying in Rome, he found himself attracted to Roman Catholicism, and as I mentioned earlier, he became a Catholic, though not an uncritical one. He simply found himself religious, unable to do anything about it. As he said, at a certain age, you realize what you are, and there's nothing you can do about it. I just am religious. It's not rational, but if I try to repress it, I have a sense of loss. But his Catholicism, however, was far from narrow, and a visit to a Zen monastery in South Korea gave him also a feel for Buddhism as well. And I think that's reflected in some of these paintings. This one, for instance, called Seeking Treasure Blindfold, 1999. She Finds the Treasure, 1999. This is called Within Everything, from 1998. This is called The Interior Journey from 1963. The Temple from 1964. And The Marvellous House from 1962. Now, he used and needed biblical images because this was the way he could get away from art simply as a form of private self-expression. And this was because biblical stories have a wider potential universal resonance. In addition, his interest in Buddhism widened this out even further. At the same time, such was his unerring sense of colour. It's been well said that his paintings can work at the abstract level alone, even without any religious connotations. But familiar biblical stories, painted in his unique style, came to be his most distinctive work. The feeding of the 5,000, Jesus stripped of his garments, Jesus sleeps through the storm, the Sermon on the Mount. Presentation in the temple. Coming home. Crossing the water to the promised land. For Herbert was one of those people who, after going through a dark wood for much of his life, found his style and himself in order to enter a productive and very happy final period of his life, which is reflected, for instance, in this of the garden. His last paintings are on women in idyllic gardens and looking out of a window. They're inscribed with the words of William Blake, made for joy and woe. Blake, like so many of the people we've been considering in this series, his favourite artist. It's called Clock 2008. We now move on to Norman Adams, 1927 to 2005. This is the painter in his studio. Born into a working-class family in Walthamstow, and despite his opposition from the age of 6, developed and pursued a passionate desire to be an artist. Won a scholarship to the Harrow School of Art when he was 13, and when he was 18, further progress was interrupted by his call up to do national service. Under the strong political influence of Anna Butts, a fellow student whom he married, he registered as a conscientious objector, having to spend time in jail before being sent to work on a farm. And his drawings from this period reveal a strong sense of sympathy for suffering humanity, as well as the influence of the German expressionists and James Ensor. He said, "I grew up beginning to associate art and religious and political thinking as one big thing that had to be dealt with as a whole." These are called Gates of Paradise, 1947, which is anything but paradise, of course. He had the support of the communist art critic John Berger until, as Adams put it, the religious thing kicked in. He went to the Royal College of Art, where he was a prize winner, and for all his career combined teaching with painting, obtaining a number of prestigious posts, including being keeper of the Royal Academy. His time at the Academy was followed by recognition of his work in a prestigious Young Contemporaries exhibition and commissions to do opera sets and large murals. However, before long, he made one of the most important decisions of his life to move to Yorkshire, high in the Pennines. It was here, rather than his early travels on the continent, that he really discovered colour, though much later in life, on the Van Gogh trail, he did discover some even more vivid reds and blues. Colour was fundamental to his art, and it was through colour in all its shades and forms that he pursued his vision. John Ruskin had written, "If the artist has to choose between form and colour, go for colour." Adams could be said to have followed that advice, though for him there's no final tension in the achieved balance of form and colour. A further momentous decision was made when they first stayed and then purchased a croft on the isolated island of Scarpa. Before that, they'd spent, this is Trees in Snow in West Yorkshire. Before that, they'd spent time on West Harris. This is Stormy Weather in West Harris. This is Evening Study from Scarpa. This is Mist in the Sound. This is an orchard in the Ardèche where it begins to take up some different colours. And some of those colours are reflected in this. Seems to be an orchard, but in fact it's called The Death of Socrates. Now, although he sometimes felt that his career had suffered by moving away from the London art scene, he also knew that nature was absolutely fundamental to his vision. He needed to be in one of those isolated places. He wasn't a nature artist in any simple sense. It was nature that allowed his imagination to take off. In 1970 he wrote, "My favourite artist, indeed my favourite man, has always been, yes, William Blake, and he of all people has had most influence on me, except in his opinion of nature, and I don't believe him when he says nature always dried up the imagination in him." Unlike Blake, Adams drew on nature throughout his career. And although a city dweller for much of his life as well, Adams seems to have connected the countryside with spiritual inspiration, claiming that city artists lose their heritage and are spiritually emasculated. Adams was commissioned by the Church of Our Lady in Milton Keynes in 1974-75 to do a set of Stations of the Cross, which he did in ceramic. His wife, Anna Adams, was a ceramic artist, and they combined on this together. And he said he tried to make them simple and intimate, passionate and unthreatening, small in scale and placed at eye level on the wall. I hope the viewer will find him or herself taken into the drama and able to identify with the main characters. And he did a Resurrection as an altar place. Sorry, there's Jesus Falls for the Second Time. Jesus Falls for the Third Time. Nailing on the Cross. The Crucifixion. And the Resurrection, which is on the altarpiece. He was also commissioned to do another set of Stations of the Cross in 1993 by Canon Dennis Clinch for St Mary's, Mulberry Street in Manchester. When Father Clinch asked Wendy Beckett to recommend an artist for commission in his church, she submitted a list, and he chose Norman Adams. The work he produced he regarded as the greatest of his life, profoundly moving in its sense of suffering and compassion. This is Jesus condemned to death, ecce homo. Jesus stripped of his garments. Jesus dies on the cross. Jesus is buried in the tomb. When I first saw these, when they were exhibited at the Royal Academy, before they were installed in the Church of St Mary's, Mulberry Street, I suppose about 25 or 30 years ago now, the impression of those heads, the sheer agony of them, was totally intense and almost unbearable. And then right at the end you come across this painting, and somehow, although it's called Jesus is buried in the tomb, it also does seem to be a kind of resurrection. There seems to be so much life and joy in it, and so much kind of raising up, that actually at the end of it, looking at that, you are left with something very positive. This is called Silent Meeting in the year, painting the year 2000. Towards the end of his life, at least from a spiritual point of view, his painting came to its consummation in his great large watercolours. He described himself as a compulsive believer, but one who looked to religion to give him inspiration rather than instruction. And this move away from oil to watercolour was largely forced on him by the progress of his Parkinson's disease. More profoundly, it brought out even more strongly his spiritual vision. The emergence of Brit art left him feeling rejected. And indeed, when the Saatchi-inspired exhibition appeared in 1997 under the title Sensation, he exploded. Art is about anything but sensation, he said. Earlier in life, he'd experienced a moment of revelation when looking at a butterfly. And he realized that the beauty of the butterfly existed just for its own sake, and it gave him an abiding sense that whatever else might be part of the picture, beauty needed to be part of it. He denied that his paintings were abstract. He saw them in terms of the human journey, that journey with its joy and suffering being conveyed through forms of colour. He needed nature to inspire him, but what it inspired was a search for form through colour. But the forms were not simply for their own sake. He said quite a number of things about religion. He said the religion he found his way into through art was a religion of life. This was a religion in which the aesthetic and the religious, and indeed all life, were one. As he said in an interview in 1978, I discovered art before I discovered religion. What art, and I include music as well as painting, did for me was to open a new way. It showed that religion was not all about death, but about life. I think art is about life, about people, about living. He wouldn't be very explicit about the religious meaning of his paintings. He said, the religious subject matter of many of my paintings is rarely a statement of faith. It's nearly always a formal questioning. All my work evolves from a kind of puzzlement, excitement, and at best love. It's fed by the arts and nature. I believe that the best of man is in the arts. They're the best reason for optimism. I think I've shown that painting before. I think when we did a series on the resurrection, it's one that I'm particularly fond of because it is one which has the cross central in it, as we can see, but somehow the cross is not simply seen as an icon of despair. Together with the butterflies and the colour and everything surrounding it, you do get a sense of resurrection and a hope from it. So what I've tried to do today is show the very wide range of religious art that was being produced over that period, 1960s, 1970s, and to some extent the 1980s. Some of it by very well-known artists like Elizabeth Frink, other people you will not have heard of at all. I've dealt rather more expensively with two of them, Albert Herbert and Norman Adams, because I do think, following Wendy Beckett, that both of those two did have something very distinctive about their understanding of art and religion, which stands above so much of the work of the time, and which will, I believe, endure. So with that, I think we'll open up just for a few minutes questions, if we may.
Could you say a little more about Reilly, and in particular, if you could tell us the scale of his largest paintings and whether any of them are in religious buildings, in cathedrals or churches?
Some of his early paintings, which are they're not his best, are in the Methodist art collection, which you can see those on the web. The size of them is they're about I think they're up to about here, where I'm thinking, and about half the width. So, if you like, about a quarter of the size of the screen. That's the size of them. He did not, so far as I know, receive many commissions for churches. The way I know his work, because there's a very good book which has nearly all his paintings in, and if you're interested in his work, it's well worth getting. They're very well reproduced colour reproductions of all his paintings. Some of them are also on the internet as well. But it's a good question because it does raise the question as to why his work wasn't commissioned more by churches. You like it, do you? Yeah, yes. It is very accessible, doesn't it? It is very accessible, and it's clearly he's got his own voice. It's unlike anything else. And I shared with you my doubts about it as to whether it's too much taken up into the harmony and the elegance of eternity. But perhaps in a world where everybody else is emphasizing the suffering, that's the fault on the right side.
I am a very strong agnostic, having come through a number of religions, and I'm asking you as a religious, as a divine, when I look at many of the paintings you've shown, they do something to me. You haven't got a conversion on your hands, but
well, there we are. I'm ready with the blessing, sir. I'm ready with the blessing.
There you are.
Don't rule it out.
There you are.
Don't rule it out.
But with the move, which I think you've sort of described from the early years or the previous centuries, of depiction of religious scenes as truth, if I may put it in that quote, to the depiction of religious scenes as perhaps truth, and metaphor, simile, sign, which will appeal to me. Do you feel that's the way it's going? And if that move towards sign, away from literal biblical truth, is going to further faith or act against it?
Well, that's a very interesting series of questions, if I might say. No, I genuinely mean it. You only phrase it as one, but a very proper question. But actually, it raises a whole range of other other questions and other issues. First of all, I would say that Christian painting in every age, however historical it seemed to have been, has also been understood as a kind of sign, as a sign to the eternal verities which were made manifest in the biblical story. So it's not new to having a sign. Now, you can also use the sign, and you may have been using it in the modern world in two senses, either a sign of eternity, as it was, but in a much more general sense, or a sign about something about the human condition. And it may be that I think you're using it in that latter sense. But the fact that you say you were moved by these, and you ask that kind of question, it does pose the question, why is it that we are still moved by some of these? Now, it is true that particularly the last two people both the last two people that I showed, Herbert and Norman Adams, they both saw themselves as being profoundly religious, but not in any orthodox kind of way. And they both found it very, very difficult. Herbert became a Roman Catholic. Norman Adams found it very difficult to say, what was the content of his religion. So I think it is a puzzle as to why paintings on these themes can move us, whether or not we have any religious belief or not. I don't want to go on for too long, but my answer in the end would be that the aesthetic and the spiritual cannot be finally disassociated. It's no accident that historically Christianity has always aligned itself with Platonism and always thought of goodness and truth and beauty all aligned together in the very being of God. And so St. Augustine addresses God, "O thou beauty most ancient and withal so fresh." Because in Western Protestantism, we've tended to have lost that sense. So I think it's the coming together as the aesthetic and the spiritual which make a particularly intense impression on us. And that's what it may have done to do, bring the fact these are brought together. The lecture next time is the last one in this series, where we'll be looking at contemporary Christian paintings. I think people have got the date of that. It's in March. Thank you very much.
For more information, please visit www.gresham.ac.uk.